let me introduce our superstar panel with me throughout the entire show. Konstantin Kisin is a comedian and writer who hosts the Trigonometry podcast. The GB News political correspondent Tom Harwood, the hardest working man on the channel today, is here as well. And Andrew Doyle is the host of Free Speech Nation on Saturdays here at GB News. Great to have you all here. We'll be hoping to get Dominique Samuels with us very shortly. I think she's in New York tonight. But look, Tom, why were all of these MPs, these 49 Tory MPs who voted against the delay to Freedom Day? Two questions to you. Why were they wrong? And why hasn't there been much coverage of what is really a very, very significant rebellion?
Well, I think the first reason, the last question that you posed to me is the easiest to answer, and that's because it was always a foregone conclusion, this vote. It wasn't very hard to rebel against the government because we all knew the way the vote was going. So while where votes are closer, rebellions matter more. Where votes are foregone conclusions, people do feel like they can make a point. And I think a lot of Tory MPs do want to make a point because a lot of people are deeply frustrated. I'm deeply frustrated. I bought nightclub tickets for the 21st of June, and I've had them refunded to me this week because I can't go, and that's deeply annoying. But I don't blame the extension of a lockdown for that. I blame the fact that we let in the Indian variant that scuppered all of those plans for that. That's the reality. The reality is that cases shot up far faster than anyone was expecting. Hospitalisations are now, as they do, following that indicator, and sadly, yes, deaths will follow that too. And whilst there has been some turnaround in the data as we vaccinate more of our population, almost half now double vaxxed, but not yet, as we vaccinate more, cases will grow more slowly, hospitalisations will come down. Sadly, this Indian variant has meant that we need to double rather than single vax to get the same effect. But when we get to that stage, these restrictions will go, as they have gone step by step.
Konstantin, great to have you on the show, firstly. An absolute pleasure that you're going to be here every Thursday night. Where do you stand on this delay to Freedom Day?
Well, there are two issues here, aren't there, really, Dan? The first is, do we have a credible opposition? And the answer to that is no. So that's quite a big problem. And Labour Party, a party for which I've voted more than for any other party, now offer no opposition to the government whatsoever, which should worry all of us, whatever your position is on lockdown itself. But in terms of lockdown, I mean, Tom talks about hospitalisations. At the time the government made this decision, Tom, there were more hospitals in England than there were people with COVID in hospital, right? So I don't think...
It's about the trend, Konstantin. It's not about the numbers at the time.
Well, I think you could make that argument when there's nobody in hospital at all. It's about the trends. We went from 0 people to 3 people. I mean, that is logic that will mean when we never get out of this at all. And now that we've vaccinated such a huge proportion of the population, I think the idea that we're seeing mass hospitalizations when in fact the hospitals are empty, less than 1% of the people currently in hospital are there with COVID, not because of COVID, with COVID. So this notion that somehow we're about to be overwhelmed and the NHS is about to collapse is complete nonsense. And so the idea that we would extend restrictions that really punish people who are trying to restart their businesses, trying to rebuild their lives after a very difficult period of time in which many people sadly have taken their lives due to depression, due to mental health issues, the fact that we are continuing to do this when we've vaccinated double jabbed, as you say yourself, over half of the population.
Not quite half.
Well, we're getting there, right?
Yeah.
And what's the percentage on the people who've had at least one jab?
Oh, it's around 60.
Exactly. So we've done a pretty good job on getting the vaccines out. And I think in that situation, I understand that people are concerned, but we should look at the facts rather than giving in to fear.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with that. And Andrew Doyle, it's very interesting. The reason why I wanted to share some of those words from the Tory rebels is because there is a genuine fear now that actually we're just heading towards a constant cycle of restrictions. Chris Whitty today warning that we're going to have a very tough winter. You know what that means. And I was listening to the Planet Normal podcast, which is hosted by our very own Liam Halligan and Alison Pearson as well. They had a really interesting interview with Ian Duncan Smith, who says an opinion that I share, which is that he's very, very concerned that lockdowns could just become a way to deal with seasonal flu if we're not careful.
Yeah, I think we do have to be careful about that. I must profess, I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't profess to have any knowledge about the efficacy of lockdowns. I don't think we'll know for many, many years, possibly even decades, whether more lives were saved due to the lockdown policy than were lost due to all sorts of other things, people not getting cancer treatments, mental health issues, depression, suicide, that kind of thing. We just won't know. But in terms of, the precedent that it sets, once the lockdown is constantly delayed in this way, it means that public trust diminishes massively, and people don't believe you when you say, well, the next time will be the absolute last time. What will happen, in fact, or a lot of people are suspecting, it will become something that is just normalised, and we mustn't normalise that. And no one has yet, and like I said, I don't understand the science, but no one as yet has been able to answer the question, why is it, maybe you can, Tom, you'll know more than me, why is it the case that given that everyone who is vulnerable to serious illness from COVID has been vaccinated or has had the opportunity, or has had the opportunity to be vaccinated, why shouldn't society open up?
That's a really, really important question to understand the answer to, because if we look back at the wave that hit hospitals in January, the ICU wards weren't full of people in their 70s and 80s. They were full of people in their late 40s and early 50s. Not because they're more susceptible to the disease, they're not, but because so many people were infected that the NHS did something called triage, which is prioritise the beds for the people that are most likely to survive. The fact is, when you've got something so transmissible and is doubling every week, the number of people that are affected, the scale is such that even a tiny proportion of people can overwhelm the number of beds that we have.
So it's
and
about
that happens very quickly.
So it's about protecting the NHS.
So it's about those people who are in their late 40s and early 50s, like the Prime Minister, for example, who ended up in ICU. There are many thousands of people.
But we've got to remember, obesity is a big factor in this,
and
right?
And it is also worth pointing out, though, the CDC in the US takes a very different position, which is that, Konstantin, if you are double jabbed, return to your normal life. Rip off the mask, hug whoever you want. So we cannot say that our position is one that is shared by scientists all over the world, because it's simply not.
I think we should also remember that it's not just about double jab. There are over 4 million people, I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong, who've already had COVID and therefore have some level of immunity. Right? So that's 4.5 million people. That's nearly 10% of the population in this country, right? And then you add to that the fact that young people don't seem to be particularly susceptible to this as well. The Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunization today are reported as saying children and under 18 should not be vaccinated at all at any point. So
at least at this point, until there's more evidence.
Exactly. So we've got a lot of people, in addition to the nearly 50% we've double jabbed, who are immune to this at some level. So I think we ought,
well, over 80%
we ought not to panic.
Adults
have
COVID antibodies.
But we should add to that something else, Dan, which is I think we've all forgotten that the NHS experiences a winter crisis every bloody winter, right? We should remember that. So it is to be expected that this winter there will be pressure on the NHS, and I think we mustn't. One of the biggest problems for me, and I accept Andrew's point. None of us here is an epidemiologist, and we should be careful about what we say. My concern, Tom, is, and it's a very serious concern, is there are a lot of people who will die from things other than COVID as a result of what we've done. And I wonder, I hope we have a very serious public inquiry to find out what the impact of lockdown has actually been. Because my fear, and I'm not saying this is true, but this is my fear, we have killed more people than we've saved, is my concern.
Well, we do forget that poverty kills. Just for all sorts of reasons, and not just the depression and the mental health stuff, but for crime rates.
And we don't know the level of the poverty yet. We also don't know the level of the missed cancer treatments and the knock-on effect of deaths for many years. But we do know that tens of thousands of people died at home from non-COVID causes, especially during the first lockdown last year.
I do want to challenge that point, though, about cancer screening and all this sort of stuff. If we hadn't locked down and hospitals were even more overwhelmed with COVID patients, there wouldn't have been the doctors to do the cancer screenings. There wouldn't have been the doctors to treat broken legs. The NHS wouldn't be an NHS, it would be a COVID health service, because so many people in this country would be hospitalised, and so many people wouldn't be hospitalised and would be choking to death on their beds at home, and that's the situation that happened in India.
Nightingale hospitals, Tom, that were barely used.
Because there weren't the staff
they
for
were
them.
Mainly
there weren't the staff
empty.
for them. The staff were overstretched. Speak to anyone who worked in the NHS, particularly around winter 2020 to 21.
And obviously that's one of the reasons why I supported the
as did I. This is the point I was about to make. I supported the first lockdown as well.
Because we didn't have the PPE, we didn't have the ventilators, the NHS was chronically underprepared, the entire civil service was chronically underprepared. But I'm sorry, by the time you get to winter and you've had 6 months or more to prepare, we are in the middle of summer.
Isn't it?
We are in the middle of summer 15 months after this first started.
Tom, can I ask you something else, actually? Because you've been doing great reporting on this. And I wanted to ask, why have journalists not been asking the Prime Minister or other people who are responsible for these policies, how many people die from lockdown? I've never heard anyone ask this question. I've never
and
heard...
no cost
Maybe they
benefit
don't
analysis
know.
has been
But
done.
don't you think we should find out if we're going to lock down the whole
Yes.
country? Maybe we should know how many
But I
people
don't think
that's going to kill.
I don't think that's something you can ever know. It's just too nebulous and
But
speculative.
you have to know that, or you have to have an estimate to make a decision about what you do, don't
I think
you?
it's quite clear that we can look. There are definitely harms from lockdown. Of course there are. And the best situation would be to not lock down at all, but to close the borders and never let the virus in the first place. Sadly, we've got the virus here, and we haven't had a sensible border policy. So we have to deal with that now. And that's meant that we've had to have longer lockdowns than places like Taiwan or Japan or all these countries that we've refused to learn from in this last year and a
Tom,
half.
that isn't scientific fact, and I'll repeat the point that I always repeat, which is that even countries with the most draconian border policies still see the variants enter.
But it's about the levels, right? So you often use this example of Australia that's had like 1 or 2 cases of the Indian Delta variant. We had 20,000 people arrive in this country from India at the peak of their pandemic. That means that we didn't just have a couple to sort of seed in this country. It meant that we had such a large amount of COVID seeding in this country that we really were knocked back. Now, all that Boris Johnson is saying is delaying by 2 or 4 weeks our vaccination programme, right? That's all it needs to get us over that level.
But do you
we
think
were,
that
we were
will
all
be-
agreeing that
but do
we're
you think-
really quite vaxxed as it is. But we just need to get that little bit further.
But
And
yes.
delaying that influx of Indian cases could well have meant that we could have unlocked as we planned.
But Tom, do you understand why a lot of people don't trust that announcement?
Yeah, totally.
And how they think this is going to be another delay than another, and even as Dan pointed out, this concept that we might end up locking down whenever there's a flu bug. You know, is that something that am I being alarmist, or is that possible?
No, you're not. This is exactly what I asked the Prime Minister on Monday, because I'm very, very keen that we never, ever go back into another lockdown, which means that we can't squander the time that we win.
Tom, just very quickly, and sorry to interrupt, a little bit of breaking political news. Edwin Poots will stand down as the DUP leader after
20 days.
20 days.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's incredible. We were
What's your
talking
reaction,
about
Tom?
this a little bit earlier on Alex Phillips and Simon McCoy's show, because this is the most extraordinary event of a party leader who sort of ousted or helped oust the former leader Arlene Foster, and then ended up trying to sign this deal with Sinn Féin in order to install a new First Minister, but his party completely disagreed with the price of that deal, which was to implement elements of an Irish Language Act in Northern Ireland. So he pushed ahead despite his party disagreeing with him on that deal, and now they seem to have completely forced him out. We've been hearing noises about this for the last 6 or 7 hours, but the fact that they've actually totally pushed him out now is quite extraordinary, and it's going to really destabilise an already deeply destabilised party. The DUP is losing support on the unionist side to a party called Traditional Unionist Voice, which has risen up from basically nowhere, but also on the soft unionist side, they're losing votes to the Alliance Party, the sort of Northern Irish version of the Lib Dems. This is a party in total crisis, and it's in crisis at the moment that probably Northern Ireland needs a strong unionist voice the most, because they're dealing with such problems over the protocol. This is a real significant event.
All right, great stuff. That is Tom Harwood, our political correspondent, Konstantin Kisin, and Andrew Doyle, who will be with us later. Just repeating that news, Edwin Poots out as the leader of the DUP after just 20 days. Coming up next in The Clash, I go head-to-head with social commentator Rebecca Reid on English Heritage's decision to brand Enid Blyton racist and sexist. Does this mean the legendary children's author is about to be cancelled? We'll discuss shortly.